Hello and greetings to all, and welcome to Retalks. We are very happy to announce the launch of RIKA Institute that we call RE, where R stands for resilience and I for innovation. Both resilience and innovation are the founding pillars of the RIKA Institute. The institute is aimed to work in the sector of disaster education, training, research, awareness generation, so as to inspire a culture of resilience in the society. And RIKA Institute is the new venture of RIKA organization, which is already a successful organization. And while RIKA India has already showcased that disaster risk management can be an innovative business model, similarly, RIKA Institute aims to establish disaster risk management as an enticing career opportunity. To enable this, we're starting with a series of talk shows, evidently called Retalks, planned every month on different topics of disaster risk reduction. And the talk shows would feature experts from the domain who will demystify the science behind understanding risks and building resilience. With this, we welcome our very first guest, our very own co founder, Dr. Rajib Shaw, who is also a professor in the Graduate School of Media and Governance in Keio University, and is most importantly for our today's discussion, he's the coordinating lead author for Asia chapter of IPCC Sixth Assessment Report. And our today's topic of discussion, that is the IPCC Sixth Assessment Report released by Working Group 2, which is titled Climate Change 2022 Impacts, Adaptation and Vulnerability. Hello, sir, and a very warm welcome to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Sukrit. Thank you.
And sir, if I may, so I will ask you a few questions about your experience as the coordinating lead author for IPCC Sixth Assessment Report. So firstly, if you can tell us a bit about the IPCC and its importance and the process of the preparation of the report.
Yeah, thank you, Sukrit. Let me go back to a little bit about why IPCC was formed. I'm sure that many of our audience are possibly aware about that, but maybe those who are not into this climate business or climate research or climate related work, maybe it will be good to give a little bit of background. You know that when in 1960s, 70s, early 1980s, when this whole concept of ozone depletion, ozone hole, climate change impact, and all those things were coming up, we had quite a bit of very strong economic progress in many of the industrialized countries, and then lots of carbon emission due to very heavy industries in many countries. So we saw the impact, and there were a few papers which were the scientific papers which were written that possibly this is affecting the overall ozone layers. But those were more the scientific papers. Then people thought, or government thought, that, oh, these are some scientists are doing this, and let them do the science. But gradually we found that it is also like affecting our lifestyle. We have possibly were not exposed to some of the heat waves or some of the stronger cyclones. We have not seen that much of flooding. So these things have come up. So then there were an increasing demand that we should have a science policy interface where the scientist put the scientific findings and the government on the other side have a dialogue between scientists. And that's where this whole IPCC was born, which is called Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Intergovernmental is a very key word here. It's not just the scientific word, but it is a science and policy interface. And that was started in 1988. And then there are many different types of these reports came in. So there were 5 cycles which were made, and this was the 6th cycle. And the 6th cycle, the last AR5, we call the assessment report 5, which was published in 2014. And we were actually supposed to publish this particular report last year, But due to Corona, we had to actually postpone this government approval, and that's how it was approved finally and was published in on 28th of February this year. And also, if you know that there are three specific working groups in overall the IPCC report. The working group one, which talks about more on the climate science, like how the climate will be changing. And their report was published last year, August, and possibly many of you have seen that there were very strong implication that what will be the future climate implications to Asia, more specifically to India, many of the small island developing states and so on. That's working group one. Working group two, where I have been involved, it talks about adaptation, impacts adaptation, more very specifically focus on different types of adaptation mechanism, regionally, as well as different types of cross-sectoral area. And then working group three is more on the mitigation. And in this whole working group two report, we had in total 18 chapters. And it was very interesting that there were a few initial chapter, but then there were different types of ecosystem, like whether it is water, whether it is ocean, whether it is land, whether it is cities, so different types of ecosystem. But then there were also very important things that we are not talking about, that how these ecosystems are impacted, but we are also talking about how this whole adaptation process can be linked to sustainable development. So the chapter number 17 and 18 very specifically talks about what we call the climate resilient development pathway. And there are also the different regional chapters. There are chapters on America, small island, Europe, Africa, and I have the privilege to be the CLA for Asia. And you know, in IPCC, the definition of Asia is very broad. It covers around 56 countries, which has Russia also inside Asia. And then, of course, from the east, from Japan to west, like all the Middle Eastern countries, that also comes under Asia. So you can imagine that there are some countries where there are heavy rainfall. There are some countries where drought is very common. There are some countries like Russia, Mongolia, which are actually, there are lots of permafrost area, lots of snow area, and there are some countries which are very hot. So this variation, north, south, east, west variation of Asia was extremely, extremely high. So that is actually in nutshell that what is IPCC and how this whole IPCC process was done.
Thank you so much, sir, because to know that there has been so much variation and how interesting the process would have been to be engaging with all the different, not just regional, but also climatic and different situations and scenarios. So, sir, you mentioned that there have been 5 cycles and this was the sixth one. So, if I may ask that, what is the significance of this particular report and how different is this one from the assessment report fifth?
Yeah. Thank you. Actually, before I tell that one, I also need to highlight one point that, you know, what in the IPCC report, what we try to put is all the fact. It's not that what I think or what my other fellow scientists think. We don't put our own judgment. We just show that this is the current state of knowledge in that particular domain. And based on that, we use the word called high confidence when, say, for example, a large number of academic papers are there, and most of the paper are pointing to the similar type of finding. Then we put the high confidence. Then similarly, there are medium confidence and low confidence. So one thing we need to actually keep that in mind, that IPCC report is not prescriptive. It does not say to any government that you should be doing this. It just show the fact. It just show the science. And it's all up to the government and different stakeholders that how they would like to utilize that. And that has been the tradition for all the report. Now from AR5 to AR6, of course, there are quite a bit of drastic changes, and possibly um, like my role as an Asia chapter CLA, possibly I don't have a much better knowledge of the whole report, which is more than 1,000 pages. So, but I would like to highlight possibly four specific issues, which is very distinct, I found, in this particular report than the AR5. Number one is that in this particular report, we focus on two types of risk drivers. One is the climatic risk, which is the climate change, the natural phenomena, and all these things. But another one is the non-climatic driver, non-climatic risk driver. That is possibly in some cases governance issue, maybe some cases conflict, maybe some cases different types of demographic pressure, whether it is depopulation, overpopulation, aged population, and so on. So we need to think about that whatever is happening is not just due to climate change. There are some climatic driver, but there are some also non-climatic driver. So the result is what we are seeing. So that distinction is very critical in this particular report. That's number one. Number two is, in this report actually on all the chapters actually, and this is very important, in all the chapter, in all the region, that means all the ecosystem and in all the regions, we have identified the occurrence of multiple hazards. Earlier, we used to talk about flooding, heat wave, sea level rise, drought, cyclone, and so on separately. But now what is happening, like as you may remember that for last maybe 3, 4, 5 years, we have been seeing complex disaster, cascading hazard, multiple disasters. So there are 2 or 3 types of hazards which are happening at the same time. Some of them might be climatic, some of them might be biological hazards, some of them might be geological hazards. So that interplay between different types of hazards we need to keep in mind. So whenever we talk about adaptation, it's just not just one single hazard adaptation. We need to think about that multiple risk scenario. And that has been very, very strong in this particular report, which was definitely not there in AR5 that strongly. And that's point number two. Point number three, at least to me, the overall flow of this report become very interesting, and that overall flow as well as my like our Asia chapter flow. One is like we started with a little bit of different types of impact, then general impact, and then specific impact on different ecosystem. So one is on water, then food or health or cities or economic damages and so on. So different types of impacts on the ecosystem. And then what it did, that it actually link it to that, okay, we had the impact, but what should be our potential solutions? So that particular flow, starting from the reason, the impact, and the solution, that flow has been very good. I think that's the point number three. And the final point is, we also identified this in this particular report very strongly, the limits to adaptation. Because nowadays, in some cases, I will possibly give some of the examples later, that there are some areas where only adaptation cannot save people's life or people's properties. So we need to identify what are the limits to adaptation and what are the maladaptation. Because whatever we are thinking or whatever we are doing in the name of adaptation in most of the countries, these are very short-term adaptation. Next 2 years, 3 years, like what we are seeing around us. But is that particular adaptation measure equally valid 10 years down the line, 20 years down the line, then there is a question mark for that. So short-term adaptation versus medium to long-term adaptation, and these limits to adaptation, maladaptation. So that particular discussion is quite strong. So those are possibly the 4 points, which is quite different from year 5 to year 6.
Thank you, sir, for enlightening us on those. And since you've mentioned so many difference that this year's assessment report 6 has been able to do than assessment report 5th, so in terms of those, what would be the impact or observations when it comes to the Asian region particularly?
Yeah, means there are quite a bit of interesting observation. Say, for example, I will, like, there are some areas, say, in the coastal ecosystem, like we call that some of the ecosystem has reached its tipping point. That means that even we have the most conservative 1.5-degree scenario, you know that there are different like global warming scenario, 1.5 to 2.5, 3, 4, up to 4. So even we have 1.5-degree, like even if we are able to reduce our greenhouse gases to achieve that 1.5-degree increase, or less than 1.5-degree increase, but still there are some pockets in Asia where the coral reefs in the coastal ecosystem, they have already degraded or they will continue degradation. So we possibly cannot stop that one. So that is what we call the tipping point. So this tipping point in some of the ecosystem has been extremely, extremely bad. I give you another example in the forest ecosystem, and that is very specific to Japan also. Japan, almost 70% of Japan's land is covered with mountain, and most of the mountains are forest. From the outside, it looks very nice. And unlike the developing country, where we have lots of deforestation, Japan's problem is that nobody cut the forest. Nobody cut the trees. Now, the trees are, what they have put, these trees, after the World War II in the National Forestation Program, and that was the same monoculture forest. So it's the same tree which was put at a regular interval like that. And that's how the whole trees has now grown up. And now it is almost 70 years old, the trees. Now, when you have a monoculture forest, then this whole natural ecosystem becomes extremely bad. That time, after the World War II, when all the forest, like there were lots of bombing in different parts of Japan, so all the forests were burnt out. That time, the immediate priority was to bring the forest back. But then people did not think that we need to actually mix up different types of trees so that we have generate that natural ecosystem. So what is happening, that time actually it was a short-term adaptation, what I told earlier, short-term adaptation. But what is now happening is that this whole forest ecosystem has reached its tipping point. So any strong typhoon or any heavy precipitation, we often see a huge amount of landslide because this whole topsoil has been very much degraded because it is the same type of forest, same type of root system, and the root system is already 70 plus years old. So the forest ecosystem, even like the same 1.5-degree scenario, we possibly need to think about a different ways of handling this forest. We need to possibly cut some of the trees. The whole different concept of forest management is required. So what I would like to point and highlight and emphasize here again, that in Asia, there are this type of examples. What we are getting are that some of the ecosystems has already reached its tipping point. And possibly we really need to be very, very careful to conserve, to preserve, or to do some mitigation measures for those ecosystems.
Thank you. So that was very interesting to know that afforestation also could be a hindrance to mitigation or adaptation. And sir, specifically for India, how is the report relevant or what have been your observations?
In India, like there are two, or of course, there are many different issues, but of course, one is very critical is the food security. That still, although we have lots of industrial development, lots of infrastructure development, but still the maximum percentage of the population, they work in the agriculture sector, especially in the rural area. And most of the agriculture in many cases are the rain-fed agriculture. Of course, there are irrigation, but I think that most of the agriculture are the rain-fed agriculture. Now, when we have the changes in the rainfall pattern, two ways. One is the amount and one is the rainfall distribution. Both are actually changing. The amount in certain pockets, it is decreasing, in certain pockets, it is increasing. But more than that is the rainfall distribution pattern is changing. And that is actually very much affecting the agricultures which are dependent on the rainfall agriculture. And even within that, the small farm holder, like the small farmers who doesn't have that big land, who have possibly small land, and based on that, that's their only livelihood. So they are becoming possibly very, very vulnerable. So again, they are possibly reaching one of their tipping points that only agriculture will possibly not be able to give them the full livelihood option. So they need to possibly think about different types of livelihood diversion. And that's with a very high confidence. That's the agriculture part. Similarly, water security. The water security in the urban area. And this is again not just due to climate change. As I mentioned at the beginning, that there are climatic risk driver and non-climatic risk driver. And with the population increase, our lifestyle changing, so water demand is increasing in the urban area. And of course, the supply is the same, or maybe in some cases it is decreasing. So in that case, this demand supply gap is actually increasing gradually. And in the normal time, it is not that prominent, but when it crosses some critical point, then we see that that particular year, there are tremendous water pressure, like what we have seen in some of the cities like Chennai a couple of years back. There was a severe water shortage in some of the cities, including Chennai, even in Delhi or some of the metros and so on. So urban water shortage is another very critical area. And then, of course, the coastal area, the cyclone and the cyclone-induced rainfall, the category 3 plus cyclone, like which is called the medium to strong cyclone. And then, of course, if you go to category 5, that is the super cyclone. So category 3 plus means medium to strong type cyclones that in both terms of the frequency and severity, that is actually increasing, and that is possibly providing a major risk in the whole, both the east coast as well as the west coast of India. So there are quite a bit of this type of issues there. But yes, coastal area, the agriculture, the urban areas, even the mountain ecosystem in certain areas, the mangroves. So there are quite a bit of large range of climate change impacts in different parts of India.
Thank you, sir. And I think this was interesting to note that how the previous linkages that you mentioned between climatic and non-climatic factors and how they're playing out in India in terms of food security, livelihood, agriculture, urban water shortage. Very interesting to note. And sir, Going ahead, you also initially mentioned about this report highlighting the limits to adaptation. So, can you explain a bit more on these adaptation solutions and the limits to adaptation?
Yes, actually, the limits to adaptation, like many times what we try to do, some adaptation measures very specifically focusing on one geographic location. Say, for example, when I mentioned about the water security in the urban area. Now, when we try to do the water management, usually due to governance mechanism, this is the city's water supply system which manages that one. And that is under pressure and that is already reached its almost tipping point, and it's just impossible to have a proper adaptation measures within that particular city. And there comes this urban rural connectivity. So more we need to possibly depend on the rural area, but then it also needs, like we need to pay possibly the ecosystem services, because if we get we put like we pay taxes in the urban area, and most of the cities they have a reasonably good amount of tax collection from different services what they provide, and also different types of industry or different types of business issues and so on. But can we use certain part of that particular tax or resources to develop or to maintain a better ecosystem in the rural area, in the adjoining rural area, not only just the ecosystem and also that the people who are living there, so that some of the resources from the rural area can actually be benefited to the urban area. So that urban rural connectivity is becoming possibly a new way of developing urban resilience. So that's when we talk about the urban adaptation, there are limits only within the urban boundary. We cannot do that. We have to think about in a more regional scale. So that's one example. And another example is I mentioned about the short term to medium and long term. What we see in many places, say, for example, to protect the coastal erosion, sometimes we make some sort of wall, the sea wall along the coast, which is possibly good immediately for the time being to reduce the coastal erosion. But now, okay, for 2 years, 3 years, maybe it is okay. 5 years, 10 years, maybe it's okay. But when we stop the natural flow from the sea, from the land to the coast, when we make the seawall, and if we use more the concrete and that type of material, so you are actually blocking all the natural flow. And that actually in a long term, it is affecting the whole coastal ecosystem. And what is happening for that is that possibly the fisheries, the fishermen who used to get fishes in the near coast, but that fish is now gradually moving to away from the coast. So now they need to spend more resources, more gasoline possibly to go a little bit deeper part in the sea. And that's how the whole food pricing is also impacted. So here we are trying to address one part to reduce the coastal erosion by making a wall and taking that as an example of adaptation. But that adaptation is actually affecting the coastal ecosystem, the food pricing, the livelihood in the longer run. And those are already being observed in many parts of Asia, and that is with a very high confidence. So we need to actually think about very critically that what are the different types of adaptation limits and what are possibly the different types of new technologies we can use for overcoming some of the challenges in future.
Thank you, sir. And taking your words that with the context of new technologies and the adaptation solutions also. So, do you see any potential of private sector's role in adaptation solutions for climate change?
Absolutely. Like at least for last several years, different private sectors have been very proactive, ad hoc. I will say that their own ad hoc approaches, whether they put some product, or whether they develop some system and so on. But I will say the mitigation industries, the private sector in the mitigation sector, there it is quite well established, and they have an sort of system which is developed. There are good amount of funding which flows and so on. But when it comes to the adaptation, it is still very much ad hoc. So what we possibly need is that depending on the situation of the country, possibly the government and private sector, this collaboration is very important. Academia can actually bridge that, government, academia, and private sector collaboration. And possibly we need to develop some sort of ecosystem, what we call the adaptation innovation ecosystem, where different types of private sector can generate their own new innovation in this whole adaptation field. As I mentioned, there are examples, but we need to develop it, this larger ecosystem, to bring it more forward with new innovation and to apply it also in different countries in different situations.
Thank you so much, sir, for the very enlightening discussion on IPCC Sixth Assessment Report and its key findings. And we hope that this discussion has helped to build an understanding of the emerging new cascading and complex risks, and also the knowledge on the adaptation solutions. And this is exactly what RIKA Institute hopes to do: create knowledge and awareness to enable risk informed decision making for everyone. Thank you again, sir. And also, we've planned our next retalk session in April next month, and we would hope to engage more with you in future. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you very much.